Our first presentation will be led by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro. Tony is the director of the University of Vermont Forestry Program. His research interests are centered on evaluating the efficacy of traditional and experimental silvicultural strategies at meeting the increasingly diverse range of forest management objectives on public and private land. His specific research areas include understanding the developmental dynamics and productivity of natural and managed forest systems, particularly within the context of changing global conditions and societal objectives, identifying factors affecting natural regeneration dynamics, and investigating the nature and influence of plant competitive interactions on long-term patterns of tree growth and forest structural development. Tony has also collaborated with TNC on red spruce climate adaptation work. Paul is a professor at UMass Amherst, state extension forester, and co-director of the Family Forest Research Center. His work integrates research and outreach to family forest owners. The goal of this integrated approach is to learn about family forest owners in order to better inform their decisions. He's also interested in silvicultural approaches to increasing forest resiliency. His outreach methods to family forest owners focus heavily on peer learning, social networks, and internet-based tools. He also serves on the board of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition and is the chair of the Massachusetts Forester Licensing Board. So, without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Paul and Tony.
Thanks, Will. Let me get this shared. And thanks everybody for opportunity to present here. As I was talking a little bit with Sarah and Dan prior to starting today, us up here in the north, and just kind of for perspective, Paul and I are both speaking from not Pennsylvania or Tennessee or West Virginia. So our perspectives definitely are going to be influenced from working up here in the Northeast. But, one perspective, we all share is we're very impressed with just the scale of restoration and thinking around biodiversity conservation that's occurring in the Central Appalachian region. And so it's exciting to get to plug in even for a little bit today to talk with you all about this topic and kind of one key piece in those dynamic forest restoration blocks and some of the broader thinking you're all doing in the region. So appreciate the opportunity to do this. And so the way we're going to divide this up is I'm largely going to start out just giving kind of why are we talking about this? I think most of us in the room, have a sense, or on the Zoom have a sense for why we're thinking about old growth, and then really drill in largely the stand scale, thinking about just the silviculture we might be trying to achieve in some of these areas where the goal is to restore some of those old growth conditions that we often are referring to in these late successional habitats. And then Paul will kind of finish this out by thinking more broader scales and how we really look at that diversity of ownerships and kind of values that we might have across the landscape, achieving this over space and time. And so Will mentioned, I work with TNC with some red spruce restoration work, but ironically, the genesis of a lot of this work began via TNC collaboration when I was working with Paul at UMass in 2004 through 2007, when we first started thinking a little bit about, there was a lot of emphasis going into, restoration of early successional habitat, but we felt there was also a need possibly to translate that into late successional conditions. And so really this has been a TNC collaboration for a long time. And so again, appreciate Paboda and others allowing us to be here to talk about this. So let me get going here. So I think, old growth and old forests and many other terms that I'll talk about throughout the presentation really have become kind of the emphasis point for both national policies, local discussions about whether we should manage forests or not. And so right now there's a lot of interest in old forests and old growth forests, but historically, really a lot of why we were managing and thinking about trying to restore these forests is that whether we're sitting in Pennsylvania or Vermont or Massachusetts or West Virginia, when we look at the contemporary landscape and think about that in the context of what historically used to predominate, it was clear that old growth was quite rare relative to how abundant it used to be. And so from just a perspective of trying to restore a condition that many felt was the predominant condition over large areas, we often were saying, there's a need to restore this and bring this back as part of that larger landscape complexity. But the last 5 years or so have seen old growth, as I mentioned, really become an area of emphasis and, of course, an area of some political disagreement, too, about how we should be thinking about forests. And there's different reasons for that. And one, I think really good reason is that we recognize how important these forests are as part of the package of supporting native biodiversity in an area. Likewise, old forests, with the accumulation of big trees, accumulation of dead wood, thick litter layer, often tend to have the highest amount of carbon storage in an area. And then at the same time, that diversity of conditions we find in old forests, mixture of age classes, differences in spatial complexity across a given stand, have a lot of consistency with how we also think about factors that might lend themselves for adaptive capacity in the context of climate change. And so, old growth has always been important, but we're now seeing more alignment between some contemporary objectives and those conditions that we find in old growth forest systems. And so what we're going to get into is, how do we actually increase the representation of those conditions across the landscape? And importantly, as part of that larger balance that you all have been talking about as part of these dynamic forest restoration blocks. So before we do that, it's just worth reminding, not this group, but others, as we think about old forests, that we shouldn't just emphasize that forest condition. And importantly, the first thing we should emphasize is forest writ large, whether you are on the southern end of the Alps or the northern end of the Alps. We are seeing, over the last 2 decades, a reversing of what was a very, inspiring trend of forest cover recovering across the region. We're now seeing forest loss for the first time in over a century in parts of our region. And so the first thing I think we want to make sure we're emphasizing before we kind of get into like how we manage the land is that we want to make sure we're not losing forests, and particularly not fragmenting large blocks of interior forest. At the same token, and again, I'm preaching to the choir, there are many species that certainly might use old forests for parts of their life stage, but there are others that really need complex young forest conditions across the landscape to support them. And so really supporting that diversity of values, again, why we're so inspired with the way you're all approaching thinking about forest management across different landscape scales. And I think the final piece is that from a political standpoint, we often see old forests used as a reason to argue that we shouldn't be cutting in an area, often, either for ethical reasons or for a desire to restore, large carbon stocks to a given area. And what we've been really talking about a lot is that, if we were to cease cutting in an area, but still consume at the same rate that we do for wood products, it really perpetuates this dynamic that's been called the illusion of preservation, where we're locally protecting, but we're globally consuming. And really, we want to make sure that we're being equitable and how we're actually owning our consumerism as a society. And so this figure on the right, just some work we did for New England recently, that just shows as a region, in terms of consumption versus removals, our region actually is a net exporter of its demand. And so really trying to think about, if we're going to be managing for old forests and thinking about how we go about doing that, we need to also right size, our consumption and how that kind of balances across other values. So to get into this, I've already been using some terms interchangeably throughout this. And so it's worth just cleaning up terminology. Again, I recognize most of you are experts in this, but just getting you on the same page with at least how Paul and I approach this. And, that this workshop, we're talking about late successional forests. And really, in many cases, we're talking about restoring aspects of what we consider conditions found in old growth ecosystems. So ecosystems that really have been developing primarily under natural dynamics for long periods of time. And so the term old growth is one that's been defined clearly for a long time. And it's a pretty stringent definition that most of us use, in that these are forests that have never been directly impacted by intensive human land uses. So agricultural clearing, clear cutting, repeated cutting for charcoaling, you name it. Really the conditions that have given birth to a lot of the forests we look at today. Importantly, we really are associating this with intensive human land uses. And the reason for that is there certainly were use of these lands and interaction with these lands long before intensive European uses. And so we're acknowledging that indigenous burning and indigenous gathering and use of these forests certainly was occurring, but those are much more consistent with the functioning of these ecosystems. And so we include those forests that may have only been impacted by historic indigenous practices, which are very rare, if not absent from our landscape, as ones that we would also consider reflective of old growth. Humans were on our landscape, long before European settlement, as we all appreciate. So what are we dealing with today? Lots of second growth forests. Again, forests that established following that intensive human land use. So that mass homogenization that has occurred over large scales throughout our region. Really, what we're dealing with now is kind of the outgrowth of that land use. And so what we're trying to do now is, can we actually restore some of those conditions that may have been found in old growth? And so what we're really trying to bring back are old forests. So forests that have an accumulation of those characteristics that we associate with old growth, because they have a history of being second growth, right? They've actually been impacted by intensive land use. They never can be like a true old growth ecosystem from a scientific standpoint. But we're trying to restore, a large quantity of those conditions that may have been associated with old forests. And these really are kind of what we're shooting for in our approaches to restoring these conditions on the landscape. So this map on the left and then the figure on the right that's derived from it are now 10 years old. So add 10 to 13 years to these estimates. And not that we need this map to talk about what we're dealing with in the region, but what we're looking at here, the color coding actually corresponds to, are the forests at, below, or above peak net ecosystem productivity? So are they at or below a peak sequestration rate? And so anything that's red is over 100 years old, and anything that's a different color than that is actually less than 100. And so all of us appreciate kind of the history of our region. I apologize to Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. They're not on this map, but the trend holds as you move further south. And if I were to take this map and then translate it into what it means in terms of the area of different age classes, again, adding 10 to 13 years to this, a lot of our forests really throughout that Appalachian region are anywhere from 65 to 95 years old, really very much so, reflecting that history of intensive land use at the turn of the last century. And so that age bin, those that have been following some of the discussion around old forests that have kind of made national policy veins, also have a new term that we're dealing with called mature forest, which is a tricky one because it's never really been defined ecologically. We know economic maturity, but ecological maturity, what does that really mean? But a lot of the definitions often include forests that are 85 to 100 years old. And really, I think what's important to remind everyone, again, this group is well advanced, it doesn't need to be reminding of this, that our forests are very ecologically young. You can call them mature if you want, but 85 to 110-year-old forests are very much ecologically young ecosystems. And so if we're dealing with these forests in this age class, are there ways for us to actually accelerate them towards a more ecologically mature condition? So what I'm going to do is get into talking about different ways to restore old growth forest conditions. Again, I recognize many of you do this in your own practice or have thought this through. So hopefully this is useful just to talk through just some of the ways we look at it through both the silvicultural lens, but also through the lens of kind of landscape scale conservation and planning. And I'm going to start kind of with kind of the dichotomy and pathways, how we can get there, either through a passive approach or an active approach, and then kind of drill into the specific old growth conditions we might be trying to restore and what are the actual benchmarks we might be striving for, and then how do we actually get there with forest management. So regardless of how you end up implementing treatments on the ground for restoring this condition, there are really two key principles to think through and try to embrace in your planning around creating and restoring and enhancing these old forest conditions out there in a landscape. And the first is manage for complexity. I know we use the word complexity a lot, but really what I'm talking about is at the stand scale, when you're doing silvicultural prescriptions, when you're doing management, that you're really trying to emulate that spatial and temporal complexity that we find in old growth forests, that is really the accumulation of centuries of small scale, mesoscale disturbances across space and time that really create a whole range in densities and levels of canopy cover and species composition in a stand. And so with your silviculture, really trying to embrace that and manage for that. And the second piece is a bit of a rewiring. Again, we're all enlightened and can think about leaving trees behind out in the forest, but in general, so much of how we're trained and how we think about managing forests is that we're focused on the removals. We're managing really for like the trees that we're ultimately going to take out of that stand and use. And that's certainly still a big piece of what we're talking about here. But if we really want to restore some of those conditions that are found in old growth forests, across all community types, a component of that are large, old, decadent trees that really require time and us being willing to say that we're just going to leave them there to die in the woods. And so really focusing in on that legacy component, that's such a big part of how we actually get to some of these goals, especially when we're starting with forests that are 85 to 110 years old. So one way to go about doing this is to not do anything other than ensure that that forest stays forest and that no one does any management in that forest into the future. And so one of the pathways we talk about, and all of you are certainly familiar with, and certainly include as part of landscape scale planning, is that we have areas where we are establishing as reserves or wildlands or places we call natural areas where, basically the idea is that we will allow natural processes to be the predominant influence on this ecosystem over time. And so this is often one strategy discussed in the context of old forest. If we want forests to get old, why don't we just let them, develop on their own through this pathway? What's critical, and again, all of us appreciate this. I know we're all kind of an action-oriented group, but if you want to see results in 10 years, this is obviously a pathway that's not necessarily going to generate that. This diagram on the bottom right is for our region, but again, many of your forests kind of span a similar condition, and that if we're starting out here today and think about how long it takes to accumulate, let's say, large trees to the level that would actually be considered approximating the benchmark conditions we see in old forests, it's another 100 years before we really start seeing that goal achieved. And so if you're comfortable with that and really kind of feel like there's not a need to kind of advance more quickly along this pathway, it's certainly a key piece. But what's critical is that your intent for these areas is communicated. If there is a wind throw or spongy moth outbreak or beech leaf disease or hemlock woolly adelgid or any other disturbance working through these areas, killing lots of trees, a key decision from a management standpoint is that you do not intervene. Basically, you're allowing that to be part of kind of that structural development over time. And so it's a key consideration in this pathway. The other piece is that as we see discussions, and I mentioned that I don't want to get into the social and political dynamics of old forest, but there's certainly a lot of discussion that why don't we just leave everything alone and then it will become old forest. And as all of you appreciate, there are many stands that, as much as I would like to say, if we left them alone, would become wonderfully complex ecosystems without our intervention. There are many stands that definitely are not on that trajectory, whether it's because they have a proliferation of invasive plants, they're starting from kind of a novel place, like an old civilian conservation corps plantation, or they're already seeing the impacts of beech leaf disease or beech bark disease or other dynamics that really are preventing them from growing large trees in both the near term and the long term. And so if you're doing passive strategies as part of your approach, really being genuine in how you actually site those. So putting those in places where there actually is the potential for that forest to develop on this complex structure. Recognizing the future is uncertain, there's a lot of changes that could happen in that place, but at least today, picking stands that actually could over time develop into those conditions passively, I think is a real key piece for this. But as I confessed, I'm a more action-oriented person as are others. And part of that mindset is that we don't have much of this forest condition on the landscape. And so if we really do care about meeting biodiversity and cultural and other values by restoring that, the quickest way we can get there is actually through management pathways. And so that's really what I'm going to spend the remainder of my portion of the talk talking about. And in particular, all of us recognize, and the reason why we're having this conversation is that there are some tools in our toolbox that really can help us accelerate, some of those conditions that would take much longer to be achieved via passive approach. At the same time, one of the reasons why I tend to like the active approach is that it's much more adaptive. You're really out there thinking about long-term dynamics and how it interacts with your management. And so you can kind of balance things in terms of regeneration environments that a species might need. And so instead of allowing kind of natural gaps to be the only formation of canopy openings in that ecosystem, you can think through, if I really want a significant oak component in this forest over time, how do I balance the regeneration needs of that species with some of the structural goals that we have for old forest systems? And so this active approach, I think, provides more opportunity to really integrate some of these objectives and thinking around what our goals are for these sites over time. So what I'm going to go through are just some basic strategies for restoration, kind of beginning just with a general principle of how we should be looking at stands and landscapes prior to doing this, and then getting into some of the structural conditions we find in compositional conditions we find in old forests, and both what we know in terms of like the benchmarks that we see for existing old growth stands, and then how do we actually get there with active management. But the first step in any of this is why work against what might already be there. And what I mean by that is, we all, experience this, walking through the woods. Occasionally you'll come across an area that either has, just a small patch of large trees, or an area that recently had a windstorm, or places that might have some populations of plants that are dispersal limited, that really are already kind of showing some conditions that we would want to see over a larger scale in that ecosystem over time. And so really trying to make sure that your activities in that stand, or again, if you have these like at a stand scale, that are being protected as you start getting into active management mode. And so really identifying those places within a stand and protecting them from the impact of equipment or other aspects of the management regime you're going to do. And so establishing kind of small patch reserves, groups of legacy trees around those features, half acre to an acre in size, just to kind of work with that on the site as part of kind of achieving your long-term goals. It's also bringing in already some spatial heterogeneity into that stand, because you now have one area that is going to be developing very differently than other areas that you're going to be managing. To that spatial heterogeneity piece, a large aspect, whether we're talking about, fire-dependent woodlands or mesic northern hardwood forests, when we look at, natural systems or systems even that have been influenced by a long-term history of human, disturbance like indigenous burning, when we look at the structure of those forests, there's spatial variability is really the norm. And what I mean by that, again, is that some areas have dense clumps of trees, other areas have scattered trees, other areas have kind of recovering canopy gaps. And so most of our forests today are pretty homogeneous in their spatial structure. And so the first step often when we're trying to restore actively these old growth conditions is that how do I implement regeneration harvests that are going to start kind of restoring that spatial complexity and conditions. And so using those regeneration methods that really combine both individual and group removals of trees. So things like, hybrid single tree group selection approaches, irregular shelter woods, variable density thinnings. All of these really are meant to both work with existing heterogeneity, but also impose heterogeneity into that ecosystem over space and time to really kind of restore some of that complexity. And so in the forest that we work in, kind of in our region, often we're talking about trying to emulate a range of canopy gaps at a high frequency, like a 10th acre to a half acre, as well as also thinking about integrating those mesoscale events that are so important, like downbursts and even tornado events that might have kind of areas that are less impacted than other spots. And so kind of those larger areas that can be open with heavy retention. So looking at that through the lens of aerial photos and LiDAR, on the left is just an example of an area where they're using kind of a hybrid single tree group selection approach. So you can see kind of the regeneration openings in blue, the more yellow areas are where they're actually reducing the density to 70 to 80 square feet to try to accelerate large tree growth. And then the red patches are areas where they're not doing any cutting, so kind of protecting unique ecological features. And so once this harvest was implemented, you've kind of created this spatial heterogeneity that really was not present in that stand on the day before. And so really trying to generate that complexity, not overnight, but over the course of a harvest to generate that at the stand scale. Similarly, on the right, we're just looking at kind of a mesoscale event being emulated. So here, this is a northern hardwood system. So they're retaining 40 to 60 square feet of basal area in these 1 to 3 acre openings across this 50 acre unit. But again, that retention can be lower depending on your regeneration goals. But the idea being that you're really seeing that patchiness being implemented that would be analogous to what might happen in a downburst disturbance in that landscape. Moving into your landscapes, this is actually an aerial on the left of kind of impact of a mesoscale downburst in Tennessee that Justin Hart created. And so this is a natural disturbance event, but you can see that heterogeneity and impact. Again, all of us appreciate this, that there's small gaps, there's medium-sized gap, there's one large gap. And so really creating that type of condition with our regeneration harvest is beginning that process of restoring that spatial complexity that we really associate with old growth forests over larger areas. And on the right is actually some work from North Carolina in some mesophytic hardwoods where they're doing kind of that initial entry in an irregular shelterwood approach where they're kind of creating that range of gap sizes that they will ultimately be expanding across that site. The picture below showing that. So spatial heterogeneity is the most important kind of backbone of thinking about old forests. But of course, when people talk about, late successional forests, old growth forests, we often are talking about big and old trees. And so I can't help on the old part. There's not an old aging serum we can inject into the trees, but we certainly can think a little bit about, the big part. And so what I'm showing here, and I'm going to show this for several slides in red. These are examples of the range of densities of trees greater than 20 inches in diameter that we see across the literature and really across our region, so the whole Appalachian region, for 3 broad forest types. I recognize only a few of you are working in spruce fir as well, but if we focus in on the central hardwood region, the density that we find in old growth forests ranges anywhere from 4 trees that are 20 inches in diameter per acre up to 18 trees. And if you look at the forest types, this is really kind of the broadest range we see. And that really reflects, and again, you all appreciate this way better than I do, just that range of site types that support oak systems. And so these can be xeric, kind of more open woodlands, to more kind of mesic oak systems that have higher densities of trees. And so that range of densities really speaks to kind of catering your targets to the site type you're working with, as well as the prevailing disturbance regime. Are we talking about restoring an old woodland, or are we talking about restoring kind of an old closed canopy stand? So thankfully, we know how to grow big trees. And again, kind of the mindset piece, we often are then growing those big trees to remove them. But in the context of restoring old forest conditions, now we are growing trees quickly with the intent that some are going to be left to die, which again is tough. But if the goal really is to restore these old forest characteristics, we need to be leaving some of our what we consider our crop trees as future legacy trees. And so, working within both northern hardwoods, oak systems, crop tree release, really kind of depending on the developmental stage of the stand, really is a great way to do this. Many of you are already well versed and familiar with this, but choosing 40 to 60 dominant and codominant trees, doing minimum of 3-sided release. And so that 40 to 60 trees, doesn't translate directly into 4 to 18 like 20-inch trees. And the reason for that is that we're really carrying this 40 to 60 trees as our initial population of crop trees that are going to be either left to die, possibly removed in future regeneration harvests, or actually used as future sources of dead wood. And so we're trying to kind of build at the beginning a large population of big trees to work with that then we're kind of either removing for commercial harvest in the future, or actually including as future treatment options. So why do we like thinking about active management? Well, in the context of growing big trees, again, the reason we thin forests in general is that we can accelerate on the average tree size across the stand. And so I'm taking that same diagram, again, I'm thinking about all of our forests being in this range here. And based on the work that many have done, both in northern hardwoods as well as working in oak systems, we have a good sense for, just based on average diameter growth and development, like how long does it take for trees to get into these size classes. And so these numbers in the bottom just show this is the range in a northern hardwood forest of large trees and old stands. So it's like 12 to 20 trees per acre. And so if I start with a current northern hardwood stand, 85 to 100-year-old northern hardwood stand, they're really at a very, very small percentage of this range. But if I use crown thinning in those stands over time, by age 40, I'm already starting to get a density of trees that approximates the lower bound of what we'd seen in old forest. And so really kind of truncating and accelerating that condition over time. If we want trees to get old and large and die, then we need to be good about informing others that is our intent, and we're leaving legacy trees. And so a key piece of this is not just growing trees to large sizes, but consciously deciding on trees that are going to spend the rest of their lives and out in the forest. And so legacy trees, so all of us are familiar with this, but these are trees that are being designated as permanent reserves out in that ecosystem. And so what we select for those trees might be very different than what we select for sawlog and veneer quality trees. And in particular, one big rough old tree, really is tremendous ecologically, possibly horrendous economically. And so really, if you can, from like a trade-off perspective, prioritizing those trees that might not be as much as a challenge economically to justify leaving out there. Big cull are fantastic. Likewise, I'll talk about this a bit more, but trees that already have existing cavities, which historically were like the priority for removal in kind of our traditional tree quality guidelines, you can't just create a cavity tree. And so really trying to protect those and emphasize those, as well as those that might have complex structures, whether it's the bark structure or the crown form, as well as, when we're getting into areas where we might have, a small amount of red spruce in a mixed wood stand, like protecting that unique seed source, and certainly choosing trees that are built to last. And so this picture right here, the breeze of me just walking by those trees, I think knocked them over. Those are not trees that architecturally are going to last, much longer than a few months. And so really choosing trees that can last. One challenge is documenting this. So, certainly in the field, this paint that says leave, you don't need to go to an extreme like that. That's going to last, maybe a decade. So that's not necessarily the best permanent way to communicate the intent, but using obviously a geospatial as well as even monumenting those trees physically in the woods, whether it's burying a 10 penny nail or something next to them to try to make sure that people know which trees out there are meant to stay over time and well into the future is important. What's I think also challenging is that when we're talking about leaving things behind, so much of how we approach management and a lot of our guidelines are meant to optimize tree and stand level growth. And so we're often trying to stay away from some basal area levels and retention levels that might either interfere with regeneration goals or interfere with kind of optimizing the use of that site for production of growth. And so we need to at least accept that if we're used to using certain basal area benchmarks or other guides, that we have to start building in that there's going to be some basal area, some stocking out there that's just going to be left. And so, as we're thinking through how we implement these things, we're making sure that we're factoring that in. One key thing is that, those of us that work in, on even age management, we often have a max diameter above which everything's cut. Well, we need to get rid of that idea if we're going to actually leave things to die. So we're going to leave those legacy trees and allow them to be part of that stocking into the future. Likewise, this is a oak stocking guide that's been modified by Miranda Curzon and John Cabrick just to show different oak forest conditions depending on what you're managing for. And so our beeline stocking we're all comfortable with as being often that lower bound of optimal stocking that we're managing for. But if we're actually leaving legacies behind and trying to carry those forward in those thinnings and other treatments, we need to kind of factor that in. And so maybe we have for lack of a better term, an L line. We're actually carrying a little bit higher basal area in places to account for those legacies that we want to have out in the site. Besides living trees of large sizes, we also are thinking about dead trees. And there's a lot of variation in this. And in our oak central hardwoods, certainly a lower level than we see in northern hardwoods and spruce fir, just by nature of both the productivity of those sites as well as the dynamics of those ecosystems. But nevertheless, if we look at, levels of deadwood in old forest conditions, we generally see on average 3 to 8 cords per acre on the ground, which is not a trivial amount of dead wood out there in the forest. So this isn't meant to be interpreted as, well, tomorrow I need to create that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I also think it's worth pointing out that this is often a challenging goal depending on what your other objectives are for the site. And so if your goal isn't to fully meet this benchmark, oftentimes we talk about maybe dividing these number in two and still trying to have at least maybe 2 to 7 trees per acre, that kind of are falling in this deadwood range. So how do we get deadwood? A little different than live trees. With silviculture for deadwood, we use morticulture. So being thoughtful and thinking about deliberately managing for deadwood. Often kind of initial entries when we're trying to really get that deadwood level back up. We're talking about 8 to 10 large diameter trees per acre. And so these could be some of those trees that you're either viewing as like your ecological crop trees or that you're using to release those crop trees in the future. And then relying on both natural dynamics as well as going out there in the future to create future deadwood legacies out there on the site. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Obviously, it's easiest to cut and leave things, but there are places and individuals that certainly, if you want to emulate a tip-up mound, using that the feather buncher to kind of push things over is one option. But obviously, if you're trying to do this economically and operationally and efficiently, then that can often be a challenge. And so again, a lot of the work we do, many of the managers are just cutting and leaving things, but we do have some situations where they are kind of pushing over trees to create tip-up mounds as at least part of this dynamic, which is clearly a better natural analog, but not easier said than done. So one thing I think it's important about this is often people will view this, well, I've created my dead wood, now I can pass go and I don't need to worry about it again. But when we're really looking at old forests and the conditions that we find in them, really there's this condition we call that deadwood continuum, where we have everything from freshly fallen trees to really well-decayed wood across that stand. And this picture on the right kind of gives you a good sense for that. We have these more fresh kind of decay class 1 logs that are fallen on top of decay class 4 logs. And so really this is the result of a long-term history of deadwood being created in that stand over time. And so when we're doing this, and if we're actually going to be entering these forests repeatedly, we want to make sure that every entry we're actually factoring in creating new deadwood pulses, because we want to be emulating and creating that range of deadwood across the site. If all we're creating is kind of one pulse of deadwood, we're going to have really one flavor of that decay class over time. That's really not going to support all the species that need a diversity of deadwood. The other piece of the deadwood pool that again is even more challenging to create than down logs are snags and cavity trees. And so these benchmarks, again, these don't just include dead trees, they include trees that show cavities and decline. So these include living trees. And so for oak central hardwoods, again, 8 to 15 square feet per acre in large snags is often what historically has been observed. And again, some of those being trees that are still hanging on and declining. So how do we create these? This is a little bit, tricky in that often people will say, and certainly one strategy to go about doing that is to girdle a tree like here. This is an example in Wisconsin where they're girdling this tree. Obviously made it clear with the S that that's a tree to create a snag from. But there are two issues with that. One, obviously, is the safety consideration. If you're going to be, girdling trees, thinking about kind of future operations on that site and where you're going to have a snag and kind of how you might operate around that. But the bigger consideration is biological. And in general, all of you appreciate it more than me because you actually know a lot more about the organisms that use these trees than I do. But what makes a great cavity tree is often, it has natural heart rot occurring within it. And so those cavity nesting, the cavity excavators are kind of sensing that out and picking those trees as kind of the trees that they're going to be using and creating in the cavity trees. And so when we look at actually the function of girdled trees as cavity trees, they tend to be far less valuable, and they certainly ultimately get some colonization by cavity nesters, but it's far less functional than a tree that actually naturally develops cavities in it. And so my attitude is that if you want to create snags, one of the better approaches is just to let trees die out in the forest, and in particular to protect trees like this sugar maple. This is on the Green Mountain National Forest, where they've left this as a legacy tree. It's already got a cavity in it, and the function of that tree over time is going to be far greater than this tree that they're creating a snag in. Just a very different dynamic there. Last feature I'll talk about before kind of talking a little bit about the stand prescriptions and then getting into Paul's portion is that, besides the tree component, when we look at other aspects of old forest, that there are also, depending on the community, certain plant species that are very dispersal limited that tend to have higher abundance in old forest, largely because, when we cleared other areas, they were eliminated, and it's taking a long time for those plants to recolonize those spots. And so that's a desired feature. We can't, go out there and sow these species across the landscape. Although I know you're an industrious group, I maybe wouldn't recommend that as a strategy. But instead, just trying to like protect those when you have them within a stand. And so again, that idea of having these reserve patches, if you have either pockets of trees that are showing well advanced bryophyte and lichen communities, or even pockets of advanced regeneration that know takes a while to build up in a given community, protecting those and retaining features around them to sustain that into the future stand really is a key step. And so just making sure that you're not further exacerbating both the time it takes for those populations to build up, as well as just the limitations some of those species have to disperse across the landscape. So in terms of doing this with active management, there are two types of approaches we think about. And one is, it took a while to figure out where it got in my brain, but I guess there was like an infomercial about something like rotisserie oven. They said, set it and forget it. You put your chicken in, and I guess it's cooked and done in 10 minutes. So the same idea, set it and forget it. How do we restore old growth? So one option is that, we are largely going to take a long-term passive approach, but the idea is that, trying to get a jump start and really push that forest a bit further down the trajectory, in the near term, just knowing that it's going to take a while for some of these features to develop. And so this diagram on the bottom is just kind of illustrating an example where, doing a combination of, designating legacy trees, felling some dead wood, creating some gap openings to create new cohorts in that stand, and then walking away from that stand and allowing it to kind of naturally develop over time to accumulate some of those old growth features. And so that's certainly one way to go about doing that. And oftentimes when they're designating kind of reserve areas, some of our state folks in Vermont have talked about that, this is going to be designated as old forest. Before we exclude management, we're going to allow kind of this one kind of entry that will kind of push it a little bit further down that trajectory. One drawback to this is obviously you don't have that adaptive piece where you can go back out there, in 20 years, maybe adjust your management. Certainly this is going to favor, unless you're really deliberate with it in that initial entry, more tolerant species. And then again, that deadwood continuum, you're really not factoring in like being able to actually create more deadwood over time on that site. So the way that I tend to think about it, again, if you have the option to do multiple entries and long-term planning, is that you do not need to restore all these conditions in one entry. And to be honest, it's a lot to take on, right? You're trying to restore a condition that takes centuries to develop. It's hard to do that in a single stand entry. And so I often think about it more in terms of, do we have a long-term ecological silvicultural system that allows us to actually go out there and think about over time, how am I going to adapt to how this forest is responding to my treatments and do in ways that really support the ecological values and functions that we might see in an old growth system. So again, working with northern hardwood systems, we might be thinking about an initial entry that's really trying to establish a new cohort and trying to accelerate some of those structural components that really will be a key part of my future legacy trees and retention into the future. And then in subsequent entries, really kind of respond to how the regeneration is developing, either shifting more into an irregular shelterwood mode where I'm expanding gaps, but trying to actually balance that need to both retain and recruit legacy trees while also trying to regenerate species that are important for long-term dynamics in that site. And so obviously the advantage of this is we can create that mosaic of conditions more quickly. We can be more adaptive, but we also need to make sure that we're factoring in the reality of the economics of multiple entries into an area where we're often telling the logger to leave a lot behind and even like do things like fell trees and leave them. So there's certainly some issues there. So just to point this out in context of central hardwoods, this is some work again by Miranda Curzon and John Cabrick, and just showing, depending on the oak site you're on, whether you're dealing with an area where it's more of a woodland or savanna type ecosystem or a forest ecosystem, really thinking over time, how is that forest developing and are there ways for me to actually kind of work with those conditions to try to accelerate some of that complexity using different regeneration methods is key. So the last comment I'll make before I put it over to Paul is that we can't do this everywhere, but when we think about even early successional targets and certainly some of the work that's come out of monitoring harvest throughout Central Appalachian region, that even some of our shrubland birds, 5%, 10% retention can still be using that habitat. And so thinking through, how do we just factor in leaving trees behind across all places? Again, not at high densities if our goal is to try to regenerate certain species and support shrubland birds. But that large tree component really is absent from much of our landscape. And so integrating retention of legacy trees, I think, is just a key part of how we should be thinking about management across the board. So it's not just late successional management, but also integrating some of those elements into what we do in the landscape. And Paul will talk about that a bit more with his part. So Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Tony. As Will mentioned in his opening comments, the goal of today isn't to provide specific prescriptions today, right? The idea, I think it's more valuable to think about this on a gradient. And Tony put up a citation. I don't know if you noticed it, the Bohus citation, and they've got a term in there that I love. It's old growthness. So to me, the idea of the strategies is to mix and match, is to match them to the site, to the landscape, to the landowner goals, and choose sort of where on the gradient, how much old growthness that you're looking to develop. And so we put this diagram into our publication to help communicate that it's not meant to be a cookbook. Like, here's your prescription in all forest types and all sites and all landscapes. Instead, this is one of the wonderful, huge benefits of our profession, that we tailor it to not only the stand level, but the landscape level. So depending on what you're interested in or the landowner's goals, there are a variety of intensities in which you can apply these strategies. If you are interested in lots of old growthness within your forest, then you'd be further to the left. It might be a passive approach. It might be designating a quarter, even up to half of the trees as legacy trees that will remain on that stand. However, on the far right side of the gradient, you might be interested in less old growthness in those forests. And so that might mean just even identifying a legacy tree, a couple legacy trees per acre, keeping your eye on the coarse weedy debris, but largely implementing, more standard silvicultural systems. And of course, there aren't 4 or 5 gradients in here. It's almost an infinite amount of gradients, depending on all those factors that you're considering. Tony, would you advance that? So it's important, like all things in life, right? There are trade-offs here. And so one thing that Tony and I really focused on between the first and this most recent publication is emphasizing the fact that we're not only trying to reach our structural goals of restoring old growth characteristics, but as Tony's mentioned a number of times in his talk, also hitting those species composition goals. And so obviously, if you're interested in regenerating more on the shade intolerant side, you're going to be further to the right of the gradient, and vice versa if you're more interested in those shade tolerant. So mixing and matching. How much old growthness structure are you interested in recruiting and sustaining, and intersecting that with your species composition goals? We also need to recognize that the further left you are, there are trade-offs to both of these. So the further left you are, you're going to have more on-site carbon storage, greater amounts of late successional habitat, of course. And if you're on the right-hand side of the gradient, there are more opportunities for producing wood products, early successional habitat, and so forth. So it really is a gradient here, but there are opportunities to find yourself and implement some of these strategies, no matter what this combination of goals are. Next slide, please. So we can think of this at both the stand and landscape levels. So as Tony mentioned, at the stand level, identifying where we are, and what existing structures and features there are. And our stands are getting to that age. A lot of them are approaching 100 years old. We're getting those diameters. We're getting, some of that dead wood and some of that complexity starting. Identify those. Don't just designate those areas that are inoperable, wetlands, steep slopes. We want to recognize that the development of these structures are going to happen on better quality sites, right? We know there's going to be more biomass growing out there. The growth is going to be accelerated on these sites. And we want at the landscape level to make sure that we're representing natural communities across the spectrum. So we want dry sites, we want mesic sites, we want sites in between, high elevation, low elevation. We want these kinds of structural attributes and forest developing across that spectrum. Next slide. So let's talk about that landscape. If you can advance that, Tony. So for many of us and one more, Tony, for many of us along the Appalachians, this is what our landscapes look like. We've got these public lands, or we have some NGO lands or municipal lands. And then of course, we've got this matrix of family forest owner land ownership within the landscape. Next slide. So if you were to think about each one of these columns, each one of these rectangles as its own parcel, begin hopefully envisioning where, the landowner can be on that gradient to meet their goals, but still recruit, still create, still facilitate the creation of more of that old growthness. So some landowners might be interested in that active approach and focusing more on the tolerant, mid-tolerant. Others might be very interested in an active approach, but early successional habitat, or recruiting some of those intolerant species into their species composition mix. And so it's going to look different, but we're going to have elements of that old growthness throughout. Next slide. So across the landscape, essentially what we'll have is some of these biological legacies that are consistent with what we see in natural disturbance in our forests, but also these ecological stepping stones across the landscape, even though there's a diversity of strategies applied. Next slide. So ultimately, it's not, this argument between is it passive or active. That's a decision that should be made at the property level, at the landscape level, and the reality is we need both across the landscape. Next slide. So it shouldn't be, or we shouldn't think about this as black and white, that I'm either a person that does all passive or I'm a person that does all active. Advance, please. As opposed to thinking about this in shades of green. Like, where am I on this gradient? All of this is recruiting some old growthness. How do I combine it with my other goals? Next slide. And how do I start thinking about this at a landscape scale? Advance, please. And one more. So that there are a variety of shades of green, right? There are people everybody has different kinds of goals. There'll be a different gradient, parts of that gradient, but the reality is they're all hopefully, or you are all, or we're all recruiting more of that old growth. Next slide. And so despite the parcelization, the fragmentation we've got in our landscape, being on that gradient at some point helps restore that heterogeneity across the landscape. And then we're sort of weaving it back together with those structural elements across those parcel lines. Next slide. Next, advance, please. So I know a lot of you are working on maybe a focused property, but as I said, you're also within this matrix of private landowners. Next, advance. So how do you reach out to these landowners? Advance. So as a forester, you can be a convener. You can be the people that reach out to people, family forest owners within your landscape, let them know, communicate what you're up to, what you're doing, and what their opportunities are, what strategies they can employ. Advance. There are huge opportunities for peer-to-peer. Landowners talking to one another about why they're doing this, why, restoring old growth is important, how they did it, what their experience was. Next slide, or next, yeah. And don't, I'm a huge pie and coffee guy. I'm a huge potluck guy, like getting people together in your landscape. These public lands, if you're a public land manager, or if you're working for TNC, you've got some fee-owned land. These are anchor points within our landscape around which you can sort of use to anchor not only ecological kinds of activities, but also social activities. How do you pull people together, peer-to-peer, potlucks, convening as a forester and providing technical assistance? Next slide. Next. So importantly, and Tony touched on this, the long-term planning is huge. Whether you're marking the trees, advance please, creating the stand maps using GIS to track this, next, or actually incorporating with your management plans, it's huge. This takes decades or even centuries to develop. So long-term planning and being able to communicate this to the next managers is important. Next slide. Or yep. And if you're working with private landowners, the importance of conservation-based estate planning and land protection can't be overemphasized. Without that time frame, without those decades and centuries, this structure is simply not going to have the opportunity to be created. Next slide. So next point, please. So recognize that what we need is a combination of passive and active strategies across the landscape. Next point. There's a tension here, right? There's sort of this emotional, passionate conversation. Some people that want to, have this passive approach, others that are interested on more of the active management side. And we need to balance that tension. We need to shift the conversation from either or to it's both, and they leverage each other and they complement each other, and different sites, different landscapes, different ownerships and goals will lend themselves to these approaches. If you're interested in passive approach, great, we need you. And if you're interested in active, great, we need you too. Next. Recognize the importance of the gradient. This isn't meant to be a cookbook, all right? This is meant to actually play to the strengths of foresters, which is understanding the site, understanding the context, and being creative in the application of these strategies. Next. Please look at that landscape context. Hugely important, not only in the opportunities to connect areas of older forests, but also recognizing the challenges that might be in the landscape that might prohibit the development of these characteristics that we're talking about. Next. And of course, that long-term planning piece can't be overemphasized in terms of communicating both the management, the stewardship, but also ensuring that we've got continuous forest cover on private land for decades and centuries to come. Next slide. So I'd like to thank our partners who've been hugely helpful, both in terms of funding, but expertise and insight in this, that have really re-energized Tony and I and getting this work back up and going and into the right hands like yours and all the great work you're doing. And last slide, Tony. And of course, when we were writing this 20 years ago, this quote really just stood out to us, the importance of, we have ecologically young forests. We're missing some of our cogs and wheels. This work can help restore that, knit the landscape together, and we feel as though it's a really important approach to facing, the challenges our forests are trying to move through. So thank you very much for your time. And I don't know if there is time for questions, but be happy to take a couple.